Look at that patch. Probably bought it online. A seal wearing torn canvas shoes? Laughter echoed behind the small woman walking across the base courtyard. She didn't turn around. Wind caught her jacket, and then her sleeve slipped down, revealing a tattoo, sharp black insignia, code 731RA from Special Forces. A colonel walking by froze mid-step. Nora Rain, 36 years old, petite frame, short brown hair, wearing old canvas shoes, registered as a civilian technician serving the base logistics warehouse. She came to the training ground that day to check simulation equipment, wearing a black jacket with a patch-embroidered SEAL Recon veteran. A group of young soldiers saw this and laughed. What kind of SEAL rides a bicycle to base? Probably ordered that patch on Amazon. Nora said nothing, continued bending down to open her toolbox. The mockery continued as she worked silently, checking cables and calibrating equipment. Her movements were precise, methodical. Each action spoke of experience, but the soldiers only saw what they wanted to see. A small woman in civilian clothes with what they assumed was a fake military patch. "Hey lady, you know impersonating military personnel is a crime, right?" One soldier called out, emboldened by his friend's laughter. Nora's hands never stopped working. She connected wires with the steady focus of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, in places where a single mistake could mean death. "Maybe she's one of those stolen valor cases," another whispered, loud enough for her to hear. "Buying patches online and pretending to be something she's not." The group gathered closer, their entertainment growing bolder. They had no idea that the woman they were mocking had once held a defensive position alone for 6 hours, allowing an entire team to evacuate safely. They couldn't know that her steady hands had once assembled communication devices under enemy fire, or that her quiet demeanor came from having seen things that would break most people. "Seriously though, take the patch off," the first soldier said, approaching her workstation. "It's disrespectful to real veterans." Nora finally looked up, her eyes calm but distant. "I'll finish the equipment check," she said quietly. "Then I'll be out of your way." The soldiers exchanged glances, interpreting her quiet response as weakness or guilt. They had no idea they were looking at someone who had earned her silence through actions that would never appear in any official record. CTA Comment Act 1. Have you ever seen someone mocked for their appearance, even though they carried something no one understood? Type, "I've seen it." A young officer approached. "That patch isn't authorized, ma'am. You should remove it to avoid any misunderstanding." Nora simply replied, "Not necessary." The officer's tone became more authoritative. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist. Wearing unauthorized military insignia on a federal installation is a serious matter." Nora continued working, her focus unwavering. The growing crowd of soldiers murmured approval at the officer's intervention. This was exactly what they expected, the fake veteran being called out by real military personnel. "Look, I don't want to make this official," the officer continued, "but regulations are regulations. Either you remove the patch, or I'll have to escort you off the premises." The wind picked up, swirling dust across the training ground. Nora reached for a tool from her kit, and as she stretched, her sleeve pulled back slightly. For just a moment, a corner of black ink became visible on her forearm, a sharp, angular design that seemed to pulse with significance. An old staff sergeant standing nearby caught sight of it. His casual expression changed instantly. He stepped closer, squinting at the partial tattoo visible beneath her sleeve. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly different. "That marking." Nora quickly pulled her sleeve back down, but not before the sergeant saw more details. Intricate lines forming what looked like a tactical symbol, and beneath it, barely visible numbers. 731R. The sergeant's face went pale. 731R, he whispered. That's ghost line identification. Just then, Colonel Cain was walking across the training ground, returning from a briefing. The commotion caught his attention, and he approached the group. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. The young officer straightened. "Sir, we have a civilian wearing unauthorized SEAL insignia. I was just explaining regulations when—" "Let me see," Colonel Cain interrupted, his eyes moving to Nora. The wind gusted again, and this time Nora's sleeve pulled back further. The full tattoo was visible now, a black insignia with precise geometric patterns, code numbers, and at the bottom, clear as day, 731R bound. Colonel Cain's expression transformed completely. His eyes widened, and he took a step back. 731R, he breathed. You're Nora Rain, the Path Echo operator? Nora met his gaze steadily and nodded once. The training ground fell silent. Even the soldiers who had been laughing minutes earlier sensed that something significant had just happened. The atmosphere shifted from mockery to confusion to something approaching awe. "Sir," the young officer asked, clearly lost, "do you know this person?" Colonel Cain looked around at the assembled soldiers, then back at Nora. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space, "you're looking at someone whose service record you'll never see in any database, because it's classified so far above your clearance level that it might as well not exist." The laughter was gone now, replaced by uncomfortable silence and the growing realization that they had badly misjudged the situation. CTA Comment Act 2. Have you ever completely misjudged someone? Then one symbol made you fall silent? Type, "I was speechless." 731R was a shadow operations unit only recognized internally. No digitized records existed. In 2011, during Operation Path Echo, Nora was the sole survivor who led 4 special operators out of an encircled zone using rearguard shooting skills, in darkness without drone support. She refused all medals, then requested to step down, transferring to logistics, no longer carrying rank. Colonel Cain called together all officers present. The patch she wears doesn't need authorization. It was earned with blood, not bought with money. The story emerged in fragments, each detail more stunning than the last. Path Echo had been a reconnaissance mission that went catastrophically wrong. Intelligence failures left a small team stranded deep in hostile territory, surrounded by forces that vastly outnumbered them. The extraction point was compromised, Colonel Cain explained to the assembled soldiers. The team was pinned down with no air support available. Radio contact was sporadic. By all conventional military thinking, they should have been captured or killed. But Nora had done something that military textbooks don't teach. She had volunteered to hold the rearguard position, alone, while the rest of the team moved to a secondary extraction point 3 kilometers away. She held that position for 6 hours, the colonel continued. 6 hours of continuous engagement, managing ammunition, repositioning between cover points, and maintaining communication discipline, all while the rest of the team made their way through enemy territory. A young soldier raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, how is that possible? One person against approximately 30 hostiles," Colonel Cain finished. "She used terrain advantages, psychological warfare, and precision shooting to convince the enemy they were facing a much larger force. Every shot had to count. Every movement had to be perfect." The colonel's voice grew quieter. When the extraction helicopter finally reached the secondary point, 4 operators were alive and ready for pickup. The pilot asked where the 5th team member was. They said she was holding the door. Nora had continued her defensive action until she received radio confirmation that the helicopter was airborne with her teammates aboard. Only then did she begin her own movement to the extraction point. She covered 3 kilometers of hostile terrain in darkness while being actively pursued, Colonel Cain said. She reached the backup extraction point with 11 minutes to spare before the window closed. The tattoo, they learned, wasn't just a unit identifier. It was a memorial. Each element of the design represented someone who hadn't made it home from previous missions. The 731R designation was reserved for operators who had proven themselves in the most extreme circumstances. The patch on her jacket, Colonel Cain said, looking directly at the soldiers who had been laughing earlier, represents her current role. The tattoo underneath represents who she was when it mattered most. One young soldier, his face red with embarrassment, found the courage to ask, "Is it true that she held an entire combat corridor by herself?" Nora spoke for the first time since the colonel's arrival. "I held it so they could run, not so I could tell stories." The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any dramatic retelling could have. Here was someone who had performed acts of extraordinary courage and skill, then quietly stepped away from recognition and glory. After Path Echo, Colonel Cain continued, she was offered every commendation the military could provide. Bronze Star, Silver Star, recommendations for Medal of Honor. She declined them all, said the only reward she wanted was to serve in a capacity where she'd never have to make those kinds of decisions again. The soldiers looked at Nora with new eyes. The small woman in worn canvas shoes had once been the difference between life and death for 4 special operators. She had transitioned from being one of the most skilled combat veterans in the military to being someone who maintained equipment and stayed in the background. She requested assignment to logistics, the colonel explained, said she preferred being the person who made sure everyone else's equipment worked perfectly, rather than the person who had to use it when everything went wrong. CTA Comment Act 3. If you've ever dismissed someone, then one tattoo made you bow your head type, I didn't know who they were. Nora didn't change positions, didn't accept gratitude. I prefer being called the equipment fixer rather than the last shooter. But after that day, whenever Nora walked through, the entire training ground stood at attention. The transformation was immediate and lasting. Words spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip can achieve. But this wasn't typical gossip. This was the story of someone who had been hiding in plain sight among them. The soldiers who had mocked her patch found themselves unable to make eye contact when she passed. Their laughter had been replaced by something deeper, respect mixed with shame. They had learned a hard lesson about assumptions and the danger of judging people by their appearance. A small note appeared inside the training equipment cabinet lid. Don't laugh at the patch, check the ink underneath. The message spread throughout the base in various forms. Some soldiers wrote it in their personal notebooks. Others shared it during informal training sessions. It became an unofficial motto, a reminder that real service often goes unrecognized. Nora's daily routine didn't change. She still arrived by bicycle, still wore her old canvas shoes, still carried her toolbox to check equipment. But now, when she worked, soldiers would quietly gather to watch her precise movements, hoping to learn something from her methodical approach. The young officer who had demanded she remove her patch approached her a week later. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to assume you were doing your job, Nora interrupted gently. Regulations exist for good reasons. You had no way of knowing. Her gracious response only deepened the respect around her. Here was someone who could have humiliated those who had mocked her, but instead chose understanding and forgiveness. The base commander issued a quiet directive. All personnel were to be briefed on the dangers of making assumptions about civilian contractors and the importance of treating everyone with professional respect. No specific incident was mentioned, but everyone understood the message. Months later, new recruits would ask about the small woman who fixed equipment. The stories they heard weren't about combat heroics or dramatic rescues. They were about competence, humility, and the quiet strength that comes from having nothing left to prove. No one dared joke about people wearing old military patches anymore. The lesson had been learned. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones who look most ordinary. CTA Comment Act 4. Type, I will live with respect. If you believe truth lies beneath the fabric, not on the logo. She didn't need recognition. A patch could be mocked. But a tattoo carved when the entire team retreated in darkness, that could never be faked. The person who once silently protected the entire team is usually the one no one remembers. But when the truth emerges, every eye looks down. The real lesson wasn't about military service or combat heroics. It was about the dangerous habit of judging people by their exterior appearance, their possessions, or their current circumstances. Every person carries invisible stories, some of triumph, some of loss, some of extraordinary courage performed in moments when no one was watching. Nora Rain had chosen anonymity over recognition, service over glory. She had transitioned from being a warrior to being a guardian in a different way, ensuring that others' equipment worked perfectly so they would never face the choices she had once faced. The soldiers learned that respect should be given freely, not withheld until someone proves their worth. They learned that real strength often looks like quiet competence, and that the most valuable people are often the ones who ask for nothing in return. Most importantly, they learned to look deeper than the surface, to consider that everyone they meet might be carrying invisible tattoos of their own.